Thank you very much, Lucinda, for opening our conference. And once again, allow me from the academic side of the campus to express my great pleasure on behalf of the Institute of East Asian Studies, as well as the Center for Chinese Studies, for this opportunity to collaborate with the Berkeley Art Museum and the Asian Art Museum putting together this program. Now, it is my honor to deliver some brief remarks to open our discussion of the day. And towards the end of the day, it will again be my pleasure to be the person wrapping up our day-long discussion. So with that in mind, allow me to share a couple of reflections. How do we know if a city such as Shanghai is an interesting place? Well, we know that it's a great city because it's a city of great dynamism. And now, with this set of exhibitions, I hope you will discover, as I did the other day at the Asian Art Museum, that it is a city also of great sensitivities. In other words, it's not just a kind of place to be studied, as I have done for many years, for its history or for the logic of its social dynamics. It's also the kinds of place to be appreciated, to be examined, to be experienced for the kinds of sensitivities, the emotions, and the experiences which are captured in its material culture, in its visual images, in the kinds of things that come to us not necessarily as statements or documents for purposes of giving testimony to history, but instead are themselves objects of that past which continue to speak to us. So given that, what do we think about Shanghai, especially during the years in between those two wars, namely 1919 and 1937, which is the time frame of the focus of our conference today? Well, first of all, we know that Shanghai during those years was the birthplace, of all things, of the Chinese Communist Party. And then along with that, Shanghai was the center of working class movement in China. For quite some time, people were very hopeful that the workers of this city will spearhead the very first socialist revolution in East Asia. And then, along with that, Shanghai was preeminent as the leading center in China and one of the major cities in East Asia when it comes to banking, manufacturing, trading, printing, and then also higher education. Now, all of that is a familiar story to many of us who study the city. And then, along with that, Shanghai was the birthplace of China's very first middle class. And along with that, it's the birthplace of consumerism, of a sense of fashion, of department stores, and above all, of women in charge. That is, women, at least, in charge of the family's pocketbook and account sheets, and along with that, many other things. So what does that mean for a city to have women out there in public? Shanghai women were quite visible. And then also in charge, that is, in charge of the accounts and the pocketbooks. Well, it means it was a wonderful place for anybody who cared to visit during that time when it comes to stuff such as food, clothing, modes of transportation, street culture, street scene, buildings, public places, and public events. In other words, it was a great place of fashion as well as consumerism. Now, how did that work then, in contrast to other parts of China or other great cities of China? Well, if we think in comparison of Shanghai and Beijing, one could say that question about how Chinese is blah, 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 such as how Chinese is Shanghai, that was a question you could say had never, or at least not to my ear, had ever been raised about Beijing. You could say that Shanghai was the one place somehow that had earned that distinction or infamy, whether deservingly or not, that whole question about how Chinese is Shanghai. And that, of course, applies to all aspects of things, including the visual culture or the visual narratives that we are going to be discussing today. And then, in contrast to Beijing, there had also been this question about, do people in Shanghai actually think? That is, do they have anything there other than material culture, material desires, material comforts, material aspirations? And if they do think, how do they express themselves? Now, as we know, China's leading writer of that generation, Lu Xun, is famed for a piece called Silent China. By his yardstick, according to him, China was a nation going through major wars and revolutions and social tensions and all kinds of miseries. And yet somehow, those people of China were unable to speak, or at least not being able to speak to the great writer's satisfaction. In other words, these were not thinking people from the viewpoint of the high standards or the vantage point of Chinese intellectuals. Now, if we were to respond to that question about if the people in Shanghai ever did their thinking and how they were doing their thinking, I suppose we might be able to point to certain things, such as the visual aspects of things, how that it wasn't necessarily or exclusively with words, but in addition or instead, it was with graphic images, with pictures, and then also with objects in everyday life that the people of Shanghai did their thinking. And the kinds of thinking they were doing is also sometimes denigrated as being purely pragmatic or simply utilitarian. In other words, these were practices as opposed to grand theories. In other words, Shanghai was a town of utility as opposed to ideology, and probably quite happily been a city of pragmatic practices and local utility as opposed to grand theories or ideological positions about grand issues such as the nature of civilization or the fate of the country. Now, of course, if we were to accept this whole notion that images do speak, and they speak alongside with texts, and in opposition or in contrast to merely words, they say things that words cannot exactly capture, then how do we, as a group of interested students and scholars, approach that set of historical record? That then would take us to the chore of our conference of the day, namely, how do images speak? Do they speak in different languages? Do they speak with particular syntax? What might be the operating idiom of that visual language, and what, in the case of Shanghai, might be the sentiments and sensitivities expressed through the use of that kind of language? And going beyond that, of course, to the extent that we will be examining artifacts, framed images, or representations of moments in time, we might also wish to consider questions such as what exactly might be the socio-political as well as economic dynamics of the site, which was the urban site or the urban experiences of Shanghai, which directly and indirectly framed or produced many of the objects and images that we will be discussing throughout the day. And I hope that towards the end of the day, we will be able to make some progress in the direction of answering a couple of questions, starting out with the most immediate ones, such as, should you go over to the Asian Art Museum to view the Shanghai show if you haven't done that yet? And if the answer is no, then you might want to ask yourselves or your colleagues today here that what might you miss if you do not go there and view the show? Or what kinds of treat or surprise are you denying yourself if you aren't going? Now, that, of course, is question number one, or question under set number one. And question under set number two is, should you start considering purchasing, ordering your airplane tickets? Do you think it might be worthwhile going to Shanghai Expo to see the place for yourself, even though the expo is going to take place at the time when the place is insufferably hot, and the place is also going to be packed with masses of humanity. Anyway, so with that, I thought I open our discussion, and it's my pleasure to also introduce the moderator of our first morning panel, Professor Alex Cook, my colleague in the Department of History at University of California at Berkeley, who will take over from here.